The people you're supposed to trust most can sometimes betray you in ways that cut the deepest. My own mother and sister forged my signature to steal from me, convinced I'd never find out. What they didn't realize was that their arrogance handed me the very weapon I needed to expose them. Before we dive into this story, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so you never miss a tale of justice. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from today? Let me know in the comments. Okay, let's get into it. It was an ordinary Sunday evening. The kind of family dinner I had sat through 100 times before. The air smelled faintly of roasted chicken and spices. Dishes clinking softly as everyone reached for their favorite servings. To anyone else, it probably would have looked like a perfectly normal family gathering, quiet conversation, laughter, the usual rhythm of a shared meal. But beneath the surface, I always felt a subtle tension at these dinners. My mother had a way of steering the atmosphere, as if she owned not just the house but the very air we breathed inside it. My sister, as always, sat by her side, echoing her opinions, making sly comments that only I seemed to notice. I told myself I'd stay calm, eat, and leave without drama. But that night, I noticed something that shifted the ground beneath me. As I reached for a serving spoon, I caught sight of my mother and sister leaning close together, their heads bent over a folded stack of papers on the table beside them. Their movements were small, almost conspiratorial, the kind of body language you'd expect from people whispering about a juicy secret they didn't want anyone else to hear. My sister's hand shielded the page as though she were a schoolgirl hiding answers during a test. At first, I didn't pay much attention. They often whispered. Usually, it was about me, what I should be doing differently, why I hadn't called more often, or some judgment about my choices. I'd long ago learned to tune it out. But then, as my sister shifted the papers, the corner of the page slid into view. My eyes froze. There it was. My name, written in my own handwriting, or at least an imitation of it. I blinked, trying to make sense of it. The loops of the letters, the odd slant of the M. I recognized it instantly, not because it was my real signature, but because it was a fake one. Years ago, when I was much younger, I had made up a sloppy, exaggerated version of my signature. Something I'd used jokingly when scribbling on notebooks or signing silly notes to friends. It was childish, nothing like the careful, professional way I signed important documents now. And yet here it was, staring up at me from across the table, as bold as if I had just written it myself. My heart gave a small jolt, and suddenly the sounds of forks and knives clinking around me seemed to fade. My eyes darted back and forth, trying to read the rest of the page without being obvious. I caught sight of the words "loan application" printed neatly at the top. A chill crept down my spine. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My mother's voice hummed on in the background, my sister's laughter bubbling beside her. But the words might as well have been noise from a faraway radio. My focus tunneled in on those forged signatures, my name scrawled again and again in that ridiculous fake handwriting of mine. I swallowed hard, heat rising to my cheeks. It wasn't just the horror of realizing my identity was being stolen. It was the fact that the thieves were sitting right across from me, smiling, eating dinner, as if everything were perfectly normal. My own family. I remember gripping the edge of my chair, my nails digging into the wood as I forced myself to stay composed. Confronting them right then, in the middle of the meal, would have been too messy. But inside, the storm had already begun. There's a kind of betrayal that feels different when it comes from strangers. When someone you don't know cheats you, you can walk away, chalk it up to bad luck, and move on. But when it comes from blood, when it comes from the very people who raised you, the people who swore they loved you unconditionally, it tears something deeper. It makes you question not only their intentions but your own judgment. I tried to focus on my food, but each bite turned to ash in my mouth. My sister whispered something to my mother, and they both chuckled softly. My stomach nodded. That sound, their laughter, felt like knives. I told myself to breathe, to wait, to be careful, but a cold certainty had already settled in my chest. They were plotting something that would hurt me, and they were arrogant enough to do it right under my nose. That was the moment the story truly began. What started as an ordinary dinner would soon unravel into a betrayal so blatant, so calculated, that I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. To truly understand how that moment at the dinner table shook me to my core, you need to know a little about the people involved: my mother, my sister, and myself. Because the truth is, this betrayal didn't come out of nowhere. The seeds of it had been quietly sprouting for years, watered by habits, attitudes, and dynamics that I had learned to ignore for the sake of keeping the peace. I've always thought of myself as the steady one in the family. From an early age, I was the child who did her homework without being asked, who saved her allowance instead of spending it all on candy, who volunteered to help neighbors rake leaves or babysit. I built a life out of discipline and responsibility, not because I thought I was better than anyone, but because it was the only way I knew to survive the constant unpredictability around me. By my 30s, that steadiness had grown into something more solid. I had a stable career, a carefully managed budget, and a small but comfortable apartment that I paid for entirely on my own. I was proud of those things, not in a flashy, boastful way, but in a quiet, deeply personal sense. To me, independence wasn't just about paying bills on time. It was about finally carving out a space in the world that was mine, free from the manipulations and expectations of others. But family doesn't always let go so easily. My mother, where do I even begin? She is a woman who thrives on control. For as long as I can remember, she has measured her worth by how much power she has over those around her. Growing up, it was the little things, deciding what clothes I could wear, what friends were acceptable, and even what career paths I should consider. Her word wasn't advice, it was law. And if you dared to question her, she had a way of twisting the conversation until you felt guilty for even thinking differently. On the surface, she was charming, the kind of woman who could host a dinner party and make everyone laugh with her stories. But underneath, there was always that edge, that subtle reminder that if you crossed her, you'd regret it. I used to believe that one day, as I got older, she'd relax her grip and start to treat me like an equal. That hope, as it turned out, was naive. Then there's my sister. If I was the responsible one, she was the opposite. She grew up leaning into a different role, the carefree, entitled youngest daughter who always managed to escape consequences. When bills piled up, she found someone else to pay them. When jobs became too demanding, she quit and claimed she wasn't being appreciated. And when relationships soured, she painted herself as the victim. No matter the circumstances, it didn't take long for me to realize that in her eyes, my reliability made me useful. If she needed a little extra cash, I was the one she'd call. If she fell behind on rent, she'd show up at my door with a smile, expecting me to rescue her. And when I said no, as I sometimes did, she'd pout, roll her eyes, and mutter about how selfish I was. My mother always took her side, reminding me of how family should stick together. That phrase, family should stick together, was their favorite weapon. On the surface, it sounded noble, but in practice, it meant that I was expected to bend, to sacrifice, to give in. While they took and took without hesitation. Looking back, I can see how the warning signs were already there before that dinner. My sister had been unusually sweet in the weeks leading up to it, showering me with compliments about how well I was doing. "You're so lucky to have your job," she'd say with a saccharine smile. "I don't know how you manage all that paperwork." I'd go crazy with forms and contracts. At the time, I brushed it off as harmless chatter, though a part of me felt the undertone. She wasn't admiring my stability, she was measuring it, circling it. The way a predator circles prey before pouncing, and my mother, too, had been asking subtle questions. "Do you still use that same bank?" she'd ask while stirring soup. "You should really let me help you with your finances, keeping track of all those accounts. Must be stressful." She always framed her probing as concern, but I could feel the calculation underneath. Still, I didn't want to believe that either of them would cross a line. I wanted to believe that, at worst, they were nosy, maybe a little manipulative, but still bound by the invisible ties of love and loyalty. I told myself that family dinners, however tense, were worth it, that sitting there in silence while my mother bragged and my sister complained was better than cutting ties completely. And so my normal world became one of constant compromise. I showed up to dinners, smiled when expected, and kept my real thoughts tucked neatly inside, like folded letters no one would ever read. I nodded when my mother lectured me about how much she had sacrificed for me, and I endured my sister's endless complaints about money. All the while, I quietly paid my bills, showed up for work, and built the life I wanted, believing that if I just kept my head down, they would eventually respect me. But that belief shattered the moment I saw my fake signature on those loan documents. That childish scrawl, the one I hadn't used in years, was proof that they had not only crossed the line, they had trampled over it. It was proof that, in their eyes, I wasn't a person with boundaries. I was a resource, a bank account with a face, a signature they could steal. Oh, and that realization hurt more than I can describe. It wasn't just about money, or even the risk of financial ruin. It was about the cruel irony of it all. The very qualities I had worked so hard to cultivate, my stability, my discipline, my independence, had made me a target. My mother and sister weren't proud of me. They weren't happy for me. They were plotting how to exploit me. That was my normal world, a careful balance I had maintained for years, suddenly revealed for what it truly was, a fragile illusion, waiting to shatter. And now that it had, there would be no going back. I remember sitting there, my fork suspended in midair, staring at those papers with my fake signature scrawled across the bottom. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. For a moment, I thought maybe I was imagining things, that perhaps I'd misread the name, or that my sister had been doodling out of boredom. But deep down, I knew better. Curiosity, or maybe dread, pulled my eyes back to the stack of papers. My sister must have felt my gaze, because she shifted slightly, her hand sliding over the page. But not before I caught another line in bold. Guarantor's consent form. My stomach turned. This wasn't a silly prank or a harmless mistake. They were filling out official loan documents, loans that would legally bind me. Loans that would leave me responsible if my sister defaulted. And knowing her history, I had no doubt she would. I forced myself to breathe evenly, keeping my expression calm. I didn't want to tip them off just yet. Instead, I set my fork down and reached for my glass of water, my fingers trembling slightly against the cool surface. I took a slow sip, buying myself time to think. Finally, I spoke. "What are you two working on over there?" My tone was light, casual, but inside I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff. My mother didn't even flinch. She gave me a smile that was just a little too wide, a little too rehearsed. "Oh, nothing important, dear. Just some paperwork your sister needed help with." I turned my gaze to my sister, who looked far too pleased with herself. She slid one of the papers closer to her, as though to shield it from view, and shrugged. "Yeah, it's just a formality. Don't worry about it." But then she made her mistake. She smirked, that smug little curl of her lips that I knew too well. It was the same expression she wore whenever she thought she'd gotten away with something. Something inside me snapped. "Why is my name on it?" I asked, my voice sharper this time. For a moment, silence filled the room. My sister blinked, her smirk faltering. My mother gave her a quick look, the kind of silent communication they'd perfected over years of scheming. Then my mother cleared her throat. "Well, you see," she began, her tone syrupy sweet. "Your sister's trying to get a loan, and the bank needs a guarantor. It's really just a technicality. She can handle the payments, of course, but you know how banks are, they need reassurance. And since you have such a stable job and such a good record, it just made sense to use your name. Family helps family, after all." Her words felt like poison seeping into my ears. I stared at her, my pulse racing. "Made sense to use my name?" I repeated slowly. "Without asking me?" My sister rolled her eyes, as if I were being dramatic. "It's not a big deal. Honestly, you'll never even notice. It's not like they're taking money from you right now. You're just backing me up. And isn't that what family does?" I sat frozen, my hands gripping the edge of the table. The audacity of it all left me speechless. They had taken my identity and decided it was theirs to use. No discussion, no permission, just entitlement, plain and simple. Inside, a storm was building, a rush of anger, fear, and betrayal all tangled together until I felt almost dizzy. But I kept my face calm. I've learned over the years that showing too much emotion in front of them only fed their power. My mother, especially, thrived on watching me unravel. I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. "I never agreed to this," I said quietly, my voice low but steady. My sister laughed, a light, dismissive sound that made my blood boil. "Oh, come on. Don't be so uptight. It's not like anyone will even check. They'll just see your signature, approve it, and that's that. You've got plenty going for you. So what's the harm in helping out your own sister for once?" Her words hung in the air, and I felt them like daggers. Helping out? I had helped her more times than I could count. Paid for her groceries when she blew her paycheck. Covered her rent when she forgot to budget. Even lent her money I never saw again. And now she had the nerve to suggest I'd never helped her? I wanted to scream. I wanted to rip the papers out of her hands and tear them to shreds. But instead, I forced myself to sit still, to absorb every detail, every word, every arrogant assumption they were making. Because I knew in that moment that this was no longer about family dinners or petty arguments. This was about my future, my security, my very identity. And they had crossed a line I could never forgive. Dinner carried on as if nothing had happened, though I barely tasted the food. My mother and sister whispered occasionally, their voices low, their faces smug. I stayed silent, but inside, I made a promise to myself. This wasn't going to end the way they thought it would. I was no longer the quiet, compliant daughter or the accommodating sister. They had just set something in motion that they couldn't control. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. The rest of that dinner felt like a blur. My food sat untouched on the plate. the chatter round me muffled by the sound of my own pulse thudding in my ears. I remember the scrape of forks against plates, my mother's laughter as though nothing at all was amiss, and my sister humming happily while stacking dishes. To them, this was already decided. They had crossed the line, and they believed I would quietly accept it, as I always had. But I didn't confront them then. I've learned over the years that my family thrives in chaos. They wanted me to lash out so they could paint me as overdramatic, ungrateful, or cold. So I stayed quiet, lips pressed together, anger folding inward, simmering like a storm waiting for release. That night, I went home with my mind spinning. My thoughts swung like a pendulum. Disbelief, fury, hurt. I tried to convince myself maybe I had misinterpreted, that perhaps they were just filling things out as a draft, and they'd never actually submit it. But even as I tried to soothe myself, I knew better. My sister was desperate, and my mother was ruthless. Together, they were a force that would bulldoze anything in their path if it meant getting what they wanted. A few days later, my fears were confirmed. I was sitting at my desk at work when my phone buzzed. The number on the screen belonged to my bank. My first instinct was panic. What if something had already happened to my account? I answered, trying to keep my voice calm. "Hello. This is just a verification call." The woman on the line said, "We're processing your loan application, and we wanted to confirm some details regarding your guarantor form." I felt the blood drain from my face. My fingers went cold against the phone. "My loan application?" I repeated slowly, every word tasting like metal in my mouth. "Yes," she said cheerfully, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. "Application number ending in 4729, submitted 2 days ago. It lists you as the guarantor. We just need to confirm your consent." For a moment, I couldn't speak. My throat closed, and I stared blankly at the papers on my desk as though they might somehow make this less real. 2 days ago, that was after the dinner. They hadn't just been filling out forms, they had already gone through with it. When I finally found my voice, it was firm, steadier than I felt inside. "I never submitted a guarantor form. That is not my signature, and I do not consent to this loan." The line went quiet for a second. Then the woman cleared her throat. "Oh, I see. Thank you for clarifying. We'll escalate this immediately." I hung up, my hand trembling as I set the phone down. My worst fear had just been confirmed. They had actually used my name, my forged signature, to try to tie me to a debt that wasn't mine. That night, I confronted them directly. I drove to my mother's house, the lights glowing warm through the windows, betraying the coldness waiting inside. My sister was sprawled on the couch with her phone, and my mother was folding laundry at the table. They looked up as I entered, both of them wearing expressions of mild surprise, as though I were the one intruding. "What did you do?" I demanded. My voice shook, but not from fear, from the sheer effort of holding back the tidal wave of anger building inside me. My mother raised an eyebrow. "What's this about?" she asked coolly. "The bank called me today," I said, my words sharp. "They wanted to confirm a loan application with my name on it, my signature, my consent, which I never gave." For the briefest moment, I saw a flicker of panic in my sister's eyes. But just as quickly, it vanished, replaced by a dismissive laugh. She waved a hand like I was swatting at smoke. "Oh, that. You're making too big a deal out of this. It's just paperwork." "Paperwork?" My voice cracked with disbelief. "You forged my name. You put me on the hook for your debt. Do you have any idea what that means?" My mother set the laundry down, her gaze sharp as a knife. Calm down, she said firmly, as if she were scolding a child. You're blowing this out of proportion. It's not like you're paying anything right now. Your sister just needs a little help to get started, and once the loan is approved, she'll handle it. You won't even notice. Something in me snapped at those words. That phrase, "you won't even notice." As if my identity, my credit, my years of hard work were nothing more than an inconvenience they could borrow for their convenience. I clenched my fists at my sides, forcing myself to breathe. "You had no right," I said slowly, each word deliberate. My sister rolled her eyes dramatically, sinking deeper into the couch. "Oh, please, don't act like you're some martyr. You have everything, you're fine. I just needed one little thing, and Mom agreed it was okay. Honestly, you're being selfish." Selfish. That word stung. After years of bailing her out, after countless sacrifices I'd made in silence, she dared to call me selfish for refusing to let her steal from me. I stared at them, at their smug expressions, their refusal to even acknowledge the gravity of what they'd done. And in that moment, I realized something chilling. They weren't sorry, not even a little. They weren't ashamed, or guilty, or concerned about the risk they'd put me in. They were angry that I had caught them. That realization made my anger harden into resolve. I had spent years allowing myself to be cornered by their demands, manipulated by guilt and obligation. But this was no longer about keeping the peace. This was about survival, and for the first time in my life, I decided I wasn't going to play their game anymore. After that confrontation in my mother's living room, I left with my chest tight and my hands trembling on the steering wheel. The night air outside was cold, but inside, I was burning. Their words replayed in my mind again and again: my mother's condescension, my sister's dismissive laugh, the way they had both acted as if I was the unreasonable one for not wanting to have my very identity stolen. It wasn't just about the forged signature anymore. It was about the complete lack of remorse. They had crossed a boundary that should have been sacred, and instead of apologizing, they doubled down. They expected me to submit, to shrug and let them trample over me, the way I always had. I told myself I'd be strong, that I wouldn't let their arrogance get under my skin. But the truth is, I still went to bed that night with a sick feeling in my stomach, whispering doubts swirling in my head. What if I really was being too dramatic? What if this all somehow blew over and confronting them only made things worse? But then came the call that erased every shred of hesitation. It was a Tuesday morning, and I was at work again when my phone buzzed. The caller ID showed the bank's name. My stomach dropped instantly. I stepped outside into the crisp morning air before answering, bracing myself for what I might hear. "Hello, this is regarding your loan application," the voice on the line said politely. "We just wanted to confirm some employment details to finalize the approval process." I froze. "Excuse me?" "Yes," the woman repeated, her tone professional. "The loan application submitted last week. We just need to verify your income so we can move it forward." My mouth went dry. They hadn't just tried to slip my name onto a guarantor form, they had actually submitted the loan, using my forged signature as if it were law. And now it was moving forward, inching closer to approval, inching closer to shackling me with a debt I hadn't agreed to. I felt something inside me snap. Up until then, I had been clinging to the idea that maybe, just maybe, they hadn't gone all the way. That perhaps it was still just paperwork, a plan they hadn't yet carried out. But this call proved otherwise. They had gone behind my back, taken my identity, and attempted to tie me to thousands of dollars of debt. I drew in a long breath, my voice sharper than I intended when I spoke. "I need you to note this down immediately. I did not apply for this loan. That is not my signature. This is fraud." The woman hesitated. "Fraud?" "Yes," I said firmly, feeling the steel rise in my voice. "Fraud. And I need to know exactly what steps are being taken to stop this." Her tone shifted, becoming cautious, serious. "She told me they would flag the account, freeze the process, and escalate it to their fraud department. She also asked me to bring in identification and proof of my genuine signature." I hung up the phone with my hands shaking. But this time it wasn't just anger. It was resolve. That was the final straw. All the years of swallowing my pride, of letting them guilt me into helping, of keeping silent just to maintain the fragile illusion of family harmony. It all came crashing down. I realized, in that moment, that if I didn't act decisively, they would keep crossing lines until there was nothing left of me to protect. This wasn't about family anymore. This was about survival. I sat there on a bench outside my office, staring at the blue sky, feeling the weight of years lift off my chest. The decision was sudden, but it felt inevitable. I would fight back. I wouldn't be their victim anymore. That night, I pulled out my old files. Employment contracts, tax records, my passport, my driver's license, everything with my true legal signature on it. I laid them out across my table, comparing them against the memory of that childish, fake scrawl they had used on the loan forms. The difference was laughably obvious, and yet, in its irony, there was something almost poetic about it. They thought they were clever, sneaking around with a forgery, but they had been careless. They had chosen a version of my name that I had abandoned years ago, a sloppy imitation that would never stand up against official documentation. In their arrogance, they had handed me the weapon I needed. I remember leaning back in my chair, staring at the papers, and for the first time in weeks, I smiled, not out of joy, but out of a grim satisfaction. They thought they had me cornered, but they had actually given me the perfect leverage. That was the night I stopped feeling like a victim and started planning. I thought about every smug look my sister had ever given me, every guilt-laden lecture from my mother, every time they had told me I was selfish for not giving more, for not sacrificing myself at their altar of entitlement. And I thought, no more. The next morning, I called the bank and scheduled a meeting. I would bring every document, every piece of identification, every signature that proved the truth. And I would do it calmly, carefully, the way they would never expect. As I hung up the phone, a strange calm settled over me. It was the calm of someone who had been pushed to the breaking point and had finally decided to fight back. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. After the shock of that second phone call wore off, I spent hours just sitting at my kitchen table, surrounded by papers, thinking. The bank had given me an opening. They wanted proof, evidence of who I was and what my real signature looked like. And for once, I held every card I needed. I pulled out my passport first. The sturdy cover, navy blue with the golden seal pressed into it, felt like a shield in my hands. Inside, there it was, my legal signature, neat, deliberate, consistent. I compared it with the memory of the forgery my sister had used, the lopsided loops, the careless flourish. It almost made me laugh. She hadn't even tried to copy my real one. She had dug up the sloppy signature I had scrawled years ago on scrap paper when I was a teenager, back when I thought I was being clever by creating a fake version of my name. That old fake signature had been nothing more than a joke, a silly habit I eventually outgrew. But here it was, years later, being used against me. Except now, I realized, it wasn't a weakness. It was my weapon. Because the truth was simple. No official document in my adult life bore that fake scrawl. Not my job contracts, not my driver's license, not my mortgage agreement. I had a trail of evidence stretching back more than a decade, all showing the same careful, consistent signature. Their forgery would unravel the moment it was held up against the truth. I sat there, staring at the two versions of my name, one neat and official, the other childish and sloppy, and a thought struck me. They think they're clever, but they've already lost. That thought gave me a rush of clarity. For years, my mother and sister had relied on the same pattern. They pushed boundaries. I protested. They guilted me, and I eventually gave in. It was a cycle I had allowed, thinking it was easier to keep the peace than to fight every battle. But this time was different. They had stepped into territory they couldn't control. I could already picture their faces when the truth was laid out. My mother, who always prided herself on being the smartest person in the room, confronted with her own carelessness. My sister, who believed she was untouchable, realizing that she had doomed herself with her arrogance. Still, I knew I couldn't just storm into their house and throw the truth in their faces. That would only devolve into shouting, tears, and manipulation. I needed something official, undeniable, a setting where their excuses wouldn't matter. The bank. That was where this would play out. I called the loan officer the next day, my voice calm and professional. I explained again that I had never applied for any such loan, that the signature was a forgery, and that I had evidence to prove it. The officer listened carefully, and I could hear the shift in her tone as she realized how serious I was. She scheduled a meeting for later that week. When I hung up, I sat back in my chair and let the feeling wash over me. For the first time in this entire ordeal, I wasn't the one reacting, I was the one preparing. I wasn't scrambling to put out the fires my mother and sister had set. I was building a case, brick by brick, and I could feel the strength of it solidifying beneath me. That evening, I gathered everything: my passport, my driver's license, old tax records, a copy of my employment contract, even an old university certificate tucked away in a folder, each one bearing the same consistent, legal signature. I spread them out across the table and ran my hand over them, like a general inspecting their army before battle. It struck me as almost poetic. They had tried to erase my identity by forging it, but in doing so, they had forced me to reclaim it more fiercely than ever. And as I looked at the documents, a quiet, determined thought settled in me. This ends here, once and for all. In the days leading up to the meeting, my mother and sister tried to act as though nothing had happened. My sister sent me a breezy text. "Hey, can you pick me up Friday? I don't feel like taking the bus." I didn't reply. My mother called once, her tone sharp, asking why I hadn't been to dinner that week. I let it go to voicemail. Their silence after that was telling. They knew I was angry, but they assumed, as always, that time would wear me down. That eventually, I'd show up at the table again, swallow my pride, and pretend nothing had happened. But this time, they were wrong. Because while they were sitting comfortably in their certainty, I was preparing to dismantle the entire scheme. I wasn't just going to stop them. I was going to make sure they understood exactly how badly they had underestimated me. The night before the meeting, I barely slept. Not because I was afraid, though, I admit. There were nerves, but because my mind was buzzing with anticipation. I pictured every step. The bank officer laying the documents side by side. The look of realization on their faces when they saw the discrepancy. The way their excuses would crumble under the weight of evidence. And through it all, one thought gave me strength. They had handed me the perfect weapon. They thought that sloppy scrawl would pass for me. But in reality, It was the rope they had used to hang themselves. When the sun finally rose, I felt a strange calm settle over me. My documents were neatly organized in a folder, my clothes pressed and professional. I looked in the mirror and barely recognized myself. The tired, conflicted daughter was gone. In her place stood a woman ready to defend her life, her identity, her future. And for the first time in years, I felt powerful. The morning of the meeting, I woke up earlier than usual. The sunlight streamed through my curtains, warm and steady, but my body felt taut, charged with a quiet electricity. It wasn't nerves exactly, not anymore. It was anticipation. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't dreading what my mother and sister might do next. I was ready to face them head on. I got dressed with care that morning. A simple blouse, neatly pressed, and a blazer I usually reserved for important work presentations. It wasn't about vanity. It was about stepping into that bank looking like the responsible, professional woman I was. I wanted there to be no doubt, in anyone's mind, about who the credible party in this dispute was. Before leaving, I double-checked the folder on my table. Inside were my weapons, my passport, my driver's license, my employment contract, tax records, and even a notarized document from a property lease years ago. All bore the same careful, consistent signature. All stood as evidence of who I was and who I wasn't. I slipped the folder into my bag, took a deep breath, and left the house. The bank was quiet when I arrived. The kind of mid-morning lull where only a handful of customers sat waiting in line. A receptionist directed me to a private office, where the loan officer greeted me with a polite but serious expression. She had spoken to me on the phone before, and now she looked at me with the kind of professional attentiveness that suggested she understood the gravity of the situation. "Thank you for coming in," she said, gesturing to a chair. I sat down, my hands steady as I placed the folder on the desk. "I wanted to bring everything you requested," I said calmly. "And then some." She opened the folder, carefully flipping through each document. As she compared them, I saw her eyebrows lift slightly. She didn't need to say it out loud. The difference between my legal signature and the forgery was glaring. Mine was precise, measured. Theirs was sloppy, exaggerated, almost cartoonish in comparison. "Thank you," she said after a few minutes. "This makes things much clearer." I exhaled slowly, a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. But the real test was still to come. The officer explained that, given the discrepancy, the application would be flagged as fraudulent. However, since the documents had been submitted under my name, the bank required a final verification step. They had scheduled a meeting with all parties, the applicant, the guarantor, and the bank representatives to formally review the case. My heart skipped. That meant my mother and sister would be there, face to face. For a moment, I felt that familiar flicker of anxiety, the one that had always haunted me in their presence. But then I looked at the documents spread out neatly on the desk and reminded myself, this time, I wasn't walking in defenseless. This time, I had the truth on my side. The meeting was set for the end of the week. The day arrived faster than I expected. I walked into the bank's conference room with my head held high. The officer was already there, seated at the far end of the polished wooden table, with another colleague beside her, and on the other side, just as I knew they would be, sat my mother and sister. The moment our eyes met, I could see it, the flicker of irritation in my mother's gaze, the forced confidence in my sister's smile. They had no idea what was about to hit them. "Let's get started," the officer said, her voice brisk, professional. She pulled out the application and placed it on the table, sliding it toward me. This is the loan document submitted earlier this week. It lists you as the guarantor. We'd like to clarify the authenticity of the signatures. My mother leaned forward immediately, her tone dripping with false patience. This is all a misunderstanding. My daughter must have forgotten, she agreed. She's always been busy with work. My sister chimed in quickly, her voice light, almost mocking. Yeah, she probably signed it without realizing. She doesn't pay attention to this kind of thing. I didn't rise to the bait. Instead, I pulled out my folder and opened it slowly, deliberately. Actually, I said evenly, I pay very close attention. I laid my passport on the table, then my driver's license, then the contract, each one open to show my legal signature. Here is my real signature, as documented on every official record for the last 15 years. Now compare it to this. I tapped the loan form. This is not mine. This is a forgery. The room went still. The officer leaned forward, her eyes moving back and forth between the documents. Side by side, the contrast was undeniable. My real signature was tight, controlled, identical across all records. The forgery was loose, childish, inconsistent. My sister shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Well, it's close enough, she muttered. The officer's gaze snapped to her. No, she said firmly. It is not. I turned to face them directly, my voice steady but sharp. Do you really think I wouldn't recognize my own handwriting? You used a fake version of my name that I scribbled when I was a teenager. I haven't touched it in over a decade. And you thought this would pass as real? My sister's face flushed crimson. My mother's lips tightened into a thin line. For once, they had no script, no clever retort. The officer closed the folder with a decisive snap. This application is fraudulent, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. It will not be approved. Furthermore, we will be documenting this incident for potential legal review. I watched as the color drained from my mother's face. My sister's eyes darted to her, wide and panicked, and in that moment, a deep, quiet satisfaction spread through me. All the years of being talked over, dismissed, manipulated, all the guilt trips, and the accusations of selfishness, none of it mattered now. Because here, in this sterile conference room, the truth stood undeniable. I had walked in prepared. They had walked in arrogant. And now, finally, the balance had shifted. Silence filled the room after the loan officer's declaration. The word fraudulent seemed to hang in the air like smoke, impossible to clear away. I sat there, still and composed, while across the table my mother and sister shifted uncomfortably in their seats. 4 years. They had been the ones to control the narrative, twisting words and reality itself until I was the one who felt unreasonable. But here, in this sterile conference room, stripped of their stage and their audience, they had no weapons left. My mother was the first to speak. Her voice carried the same sharpness I'd grown up with, the tone that used to make me shrink as a child. This is ridiculous, she snapped. There must be some mistake. She probably signed it quickly and forgot. My daughter is forgetful like that. I lifted my chin, locking eyes with her. I do not forget signing legally binding loan documents. My voice was calm, but the words carried weight. For the first time, I saw her falter under my gaze. My sister leaned forward, her tone defensive, her words tumbling out in a rush. Come on, it's not like we were trying to hurt you. It was just a shortcut. You wouldn't have even noticed, and I would have paid it back anyway. Why are you making this such a big deal? Her words lit a spark of anger in me, but I forced myself to stay composed. Not hurt me? You tried to tie me to a massive loan without my knowledge. If I hadn't caught it, I'd be legally responsible for your debt. That's not a shortcut, that's fraud. The officer's colleague nodded slightly, her pen tapping against the table. Fraud is exactly what this is, she said quietly, almost as though to herself. But the word landed heavily in the room. My sister's face crumpled. She wasn't used to people outside the family calling her out so plainly. She glanced at my mother, silently begging her to step in, to smooth things over the way she always had. But my mother was pale now, her jaw tight. She tried to recover, her tone softening into that familiar, manipulative cadence. Sweetheart, you're overreacting. We're family. Family helps family. You've always been so fortunate, and your sister just needed a little support. You're making this into something ugly when it doesn't have to be. There it was, that old guilt card, the one she had played my entire life. But this time, it landed flat. I leaned forward, my voice low and steady. What's ugly is forging my name. What's ugly is betraying my trust. Don't talk to me about family when you've used mine like a signature to steal. For a moment, she had no reply. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. That silence was louder than anything she could have said. The officer cleared her throat. This matter will be escalated to our fraud investigations team, she said. We'll be contacting the relevant authorities if necessary. For now, the application is cancelled, and a fraud alert will be attached to this account. She slid the papers back into her folder with finality. My sister's eyes widened in panic. Wait, what does that mean for me? It means, the officer replied flatly, that this account will carry a record of attempted fraud. Any future applications will be reviewed with extreme caution. My sister's face crumpled. You can't do that. That's not fair. Her voice cracked, rising in pitch like a child throwing a tantrum. The officer didn't flinch. What's not fair is attempting to defraud a bank. I sat there quietly, absorbing every word, letting the consequences sink in. For once, it wasn't me explaining, defending, or pleading. It was them, scrambling, powerless. My mother finally turned to me, her eyes narrowed, her voice a harsh whisper. How could you do this to us? To your own family? Her accusation stung not because it had merit, but because it revealed how warped her perspective truly was. I steadied myself, inhaling deeply before answering. I didn't do this. You did. You chose to forge my name. You chose to gamble with my future. Don't you dare put that on me. For once, she had no retort. She sat back in her chair, lips pressed into a thin, furious line, her eyes burning holes into the table. I looked between the two of them, my mother seething in silence, my sister on the verge of tears. And I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Control. For years, they had used guilt and manipulation to keep me small, to keep me compliant. But here, faced with the undeniable truth, they had nothing. No lies, no excuses, no way out. The officer concluded the meeting with professional efficiency, outlining the next steps and assuring me that I would not bear any liability. I nodded, thanking her, then gathered my documents calmly, sliding them back into my folder with deliberate care as I stood to leave. I glanced once more at my mother and sister. My sister was slumped in her chair, her mascara smudged from tears. My mother sat rigid, her pride cracking beneath the weight of exposure. I warned you, I said quietly, my voice calm, almost gentle. I told you this was wrong, and now you get to live with the consequences. I didn't wait for their reply. I walked out of that conference room with my head high, each step echoing with the sound of freedom. For the first time in my life, I wasn't walking away defeated or silenced. I was walking away victorious, leaving them to face the collapse of the very scheme they had built with their own arrogance. And that, more than anything, was justice. Walking out of the conference room should have been enough. I had proven the truth. The loan was dead, and the fraud had been stamped onto their account like a permanent scar. But life has a way of giving you one last moment, the kind of moment that etches itself into memory. The single instant when everything becomes undeniable. That moment came sooner than I expected. The bank officer escorted us out to the lobby. I was calm, collected, folder clutched neatly against my side. My mother and sister trailed behind me, their footsteps sharp and uneven, their silence heavy. My sister sniffled, her tears leaving faint streaks down her cheeks, while my mother's face was set like stone, every line carved with fury she couldn't unleash. As we passed through the glass doors into the bright afternoon, my sister suddenly snapped. Her voice, shaky and raw, cut through the air. You could have just gone along with it. No one would have known. Why did you have to ruin everything? I stopped. Slowly, I turned to face her, the sunlight casting shadows across her blotchy, tear-streaked face. People passing by glanced at us, curious but uninterested, the way strangers always are when they catch glimpses of private drama. Ruin everything? I repeated softly. The words tasted bitter, but they steadied me. You tried to steal my name. You tried to trap me in debt that would have followed me for years. And you have the nerve to stand here and call me the one who ruined everything? Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She looked at my mother for support, but even my mother's mask was cracking. Enough. My mother hissed, her voice low and venomous. You've humiliated us enough for one day. I tilted my head, studying her. Humiliation. That was what she felt, not remorse, not guilt, not regret for the harm she'd caused me. Just humiliation at being caught. And suddenly, I realized this was my moment. For years, I had swallowed words I wanted to say, words I bit back to keep the peace, to avoid the arguments, to stop myself from being painted as ungrateful or cold. But not this time. Not anymore. I stepped closer, my voice calm but carrying enough strength to cut through the air. No, you humiliated yourselves. You forged my name, you lied, and you got caught. Don't blame me for the consequences of your choices. My mother's eyes narrowed, fury burning in them, but she stayed silent. My sister's lip trembled, the tears threatening to spill again. And then came the final blow, the one thing I had been waiting to say. The line that sealed the moment. Don't ever use my name again. The words came out firm, steady, final. They hung between us like a gavel striking down. My sister flinched as if I had slapped her. My mother's face turned ashen, the fury in her eyes dimming into something colder recognition. Because they knew, in that instant, that I meant it. That was the moment of victory. Not the officer's declaration, not the cancelled loan, but this, standing in front of them, refusing to bend, stripping away the power they had always held over me. For the first time, they saw a version of me they couldn't manipulate, couldn't guilt, couldn't control. I turned then, walking away from them in the bright afternoon light, each step deliberate, each breath steady. Behind me, I could hear my sister's muffled sobs and my mother's sharp intake of breath. But I didn't look back, because looking back would have meant doubt. And doubt was the one thing I was finally free from as I crossed the street. Folder in hand, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Lightness. The weight of their expectations, their manipulations, their constant demands. It was gone. Not because they had stopped trying, but because I had stopped allowing it. That moment, Right there on the sidewalk outside the bank was my true payoff. Not just the legal victory, not just the ruined loan, but the freedom of knowing I had stood my ground and won. They had tried to steal my name, and instead, they had lost their hold on me, and that irony, that perfect, poetic irony, was the justice I had waited my whole life for. The days after the confrontation at the bank felt strangely quiet. For so long, my mind had been filled with the noise of their schemes, my mother's manipulations, my sister's demands, the constant hum of anxiety about what they might try next. And suddenly, it was gone. The silence felt foreign at first, but it was a silence I quickly learned to cherish. The bank followed through exactly as they said they would. The loan was officially canceled, flagged as fraudulent. A fraud alert was placed on my sister's account, and I was assured both in writing and over the phone that no responsibility, no liability, no shadow of debt would ever touch me because of their actions. I slept better that night than I had in weeks, the kind of deep, unbroken sleep that feels like reclaiming a piece of yourself you didn't know you'd lost. But the true aftermath wasn't in the paperwork. It was in the shift that happened between me, my mother, and my sister. My sister tried, at first, to pretend nothing had happened. A week later, she sent me a casual text. "Are you coming to dinner Sunday? Mom's making roast." The audacity of it almost made me laugh, as though the ink on the fraud report wasn't even dry, and she could simply sweep it away with an invitation to sit at the same table where it all began. I didn't respond. When she called a few days later, her voice was brittle, her laughter forced. "You're really going to hold this against me?" It wasn't that serious. I let the silence stretch on the line before answering. "It was serious enough to ruin your financial record, and serious enough to nearly ruin mine." My voice was calm, measured, but firm. "Don't call me again." The click of the line disconnecting was like the closing of a door that had stood open for far too long. My mother, on the other hand, didn't bother with pleasantries. She was furious. Weeks passed without a word from her, and when she finally called, it wasn't to apologize, it was to scold. Her tone was sharp, dripping with disappointment, the way it always had been when I refused to bend. "You've turned against your own family," she said. "Do you know how cold you sound? You're letting outsiders dictate how we handle things that should stay between us." Her words rolled over me, and for the first time in my life, they didn't sink in. They didn't make me feel guilty or small. Instead, I felt a quiet strength rise in me. I didn't turn against family. I told her softly, "You did. You and my sister did the moment you decided my name, my future, was yours to use. Family doesn't forge signatures. Family doesn't betray trust. You broke that bond, not me." Her silence on the other end of the line was long, heavy. And then, without another word, she hung up. I haven't heard her voice since it hurt. I won't pretend otherwise. No matter how complicated the relationship, losing a mother's voice feels like losing a part of yourself. But what I gained in return was something I had needed for far longer: peace. In the weeks that followed, I noticed changes in myself. My chest didn't tighten when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I no longer dreaded Sunday dinners. I stopped tiptoeing around conversations, bracing for the guilt trips and accusations. For the first time in years, my life felt like it was truly my own. And my sister? Word got back to me through a cousin. Apparently, she tried applying for another loan, and the fraud flag popped up. The application was denied before it even got off the ground. She'd tried again with a different bank, only to find her record shadowed her wherever she went. It turns out banks don't take kindly to forgery. especially when it involves attempting to defraud one of their guarantor systems. Her financial world crumbled, not because I exposed her, but because she exposed herself. That was the irony, the karmic justice that still makes me shake my head in awe. She tried to use my name to build a life for herself, and in doing so, she ruined her own. As for my mother, she retreated into silence. The last time I heard from a family friend, she was telling anyone who would listen that I had turned cruel, that I had abandoned her and my sister. But those who knew the real story only shook their heads. Her version of events no longer had the power to hurt me. I found a new normal, one defined not by guilt or obligation, but by boundaries. Clear, firm boundaries that I never allowed them to cross again. And with that new normal came a surprising freedom. I started saying yes to things I had always put off: trips with friends, classes I wanted to take, even quiet weekends where I did nothing at all. For once, I didn't feel like I owed anyone an explanation. Every so often, I would think back to that dinner table, to the moment I first saw my fake signature scrawled across that loan form. At the time, it had felt like the world was caving in, like my trust had been shattered beyond repair. But looking back, I realized something else. That moment was the crack that finally let the light in. It forced me to see the truth I had avoided for years. It forced me to stop excusing their behavior, stop bending under the weight of guilt, stop sacrificing myself in the name of family loyalty. The betrayal was painful. Yes, but it was also liberating, because in the end, I didn't just save myself from a fraudulent loan. I saved myself from a lifetime of being treated like a resource instead of a person. And that, I realized, was the real victory. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.